Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. We are in season 6 on growth. However, as always, we are allowed to break our own format and timeline and talk about stuff that comes up and that we want to feature around practice ownership, around partnership. And today we have the unique opportunity of talking through this idea of partnership, of transitions, and specifically a dental attorney who has been through so many transitions and has a depth of knowledge in this field, and has also been with me through 2 of my deals. So I'm welcoming to the show David Cohen. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the welcome. I'm honored to be here.
Well, tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and your background in the dental industry.
Yeah, so I own a law firm that specializes in helping dentists from a business law perspective. And the main thing that I help dentists with is practice transition. And I do roughly 200 practice transitions yearly nationwide. And it's something that I have a passion for. I grew up in a dental family. So my father's a periodontist, and I grew up in Seattle, and I grew up around him and a lot of his colleagues. And he had a very close relationship group called Seattle Study Club that he started in Seattle, where doctors would just collaborate educationally, but then it sort of grew over the years organically, not necessarily through marketing, but just through the collaboration of a lot of doctors wanting to get better at what they do. And I ended up going to a lot of meetings and meeting a lot of doctors and their kids throughout growing up. And so that sort of evolved into me feeling like I wanted to work with dentists growing up. And so I played basketball all through college and realized I wasn't going to the NBA and that I should do something else. So I ended up going to law school and becoming a lawyer, and always wanting to reconnect with dentists. I started my own law firm that helps dentists essentially buy and sell practices. And so it's something that I really have a passion for, given that I come from a dental family.
Well, so I didn't know any of that. So now the audience is going to hear we've worked together through 2 deals, and you're the name that I pass along to people if they're like, "Hey, who do you recommend for a transition for a dental attorney?" I didn't know any of this. So is you said your dad is the founder of the Seattle Study Club?
Yeah, that's correct. My father is the founder of Seattle Study Club.
That's kind of a big deal, and I'm sure you stand on your own, and you don't play that card all the time, because I'm just finding out about this right now. For some of our dental students who are listening, you may not know and understand that Seattle Study Club is a pretty big deal, and it is an amazing organization for helping dentists level up their clinical skills, and doing so in a collaborative study club environment. But it's also an organization that has scaled nationwide pretty amazingly. So did I get that accurately? Did I describe Seattle Study Club well for someone who hasn't heard of it before?
Yeah, I think you did, for sure.
Okay, cool. Well, that's pretty neat. So we're obviously a podcast focused on acquisitions initially. We tend to like acquisitions a little bit more than startups. And as people are looking at acquiring a practice, a lot of times this question of okay, not only how do I get through this transition, but then what? The partnerships, do I buy into this deal? Some people are associates who are looking to buy into a practice. Some of these are the trickiest transactions that people will ever have to negotiate. So I want to hit on 3 tiers, and we might not get to all 3 of them today, and that's okay. We might have to do another episode if you're willing. But the tiers are, number 1, transitions in general. The failures, when things fall through. Number 2, partnerships. And then number 3, when stuff gets a little bit bigger, and DSOs and partnerships and things like that. Because you have experience in all of these and are known for helping people through all of these. So let's start with transitions, if that's okay. Is that okay with you?
Let's do it.
Okay, so I really like timelines. When is the right time for someone, if they're about to buy a dental practice and they're like, okay, I think I need an attorney, I need a lender. When do you recommend people reaching out to an attorney, and how should they frame that decision of who to work with?
I really appreciate that question. And the reason why I appreciate the question is I think people would be shocked, but I would say 80% of my buyers come to me with a signed LOI saying, hey, I've signed my LOI and I'm ready to go, right? And as an attorney, we feel like that our hands are tied a little bit because the letter of intent, while most of them are non-binding, although many of them have binding and non-binding aspects, still, you're supposed to follow the terms of an LOI when you enter the deal. So I think some doctors take this lightly and feel like they can just sign the LOI because it's at least partially or fully non-binding, and then they'll just kind of figure it out later on and they can change course. And that's just not the case. It's viewed as bad faith to divert from the LOI unless there's a really substantial reason why everybody would understand that it's supposed to change. And so what you don't want to do as a doctor is sign an LOI and then get into the deal and change, and then the other party feels that you're retrading the deal, and that can be viewed as bad faith. And that's kind of a mountain to climb to try to change something from a letter of intent. So long story short is that is not the correct time, in my personal opinion, to reach out to an attorney. I think the best time is prior to an LOI being signed. But even before that, I know a lot of good attorneys out there, and myself included in terms of what I'm looking for with a client relationship wise is I think we all want to build relationships with the client. And so I like to be a resource if a client ever wants to reach out to me, even if they're in the very beginning stages, and just touch base. And if they have questions, run them by me. And if it's a question that I can't answer, I usually will know somebody who can. And that sort of builds the foundation of the relationship. And with that, my answer would be, I don't think it's ever too early to reach out to an attorney. But as far as the work itself, I think the best time to reach out would be when you receive or when it's time to actually draft a letter of intent to really get the motor running for the deal.
Awesome. How about associates? People who are about to sign an associateship contract, and maybe there's been a conversation of potential future ownership. Do you review associate contracts on behalf of associates, and would that be an appropriate time to reach out?
Yeah, I do. I review associateship agreements for associates all the time, and that is a great time to reach out. And I think sometimes an associate agreement it's sort of a difficult time for a young doctor, particularly one who's coming right out of school and has a lot of debt, and they don't want to invest in, really any fees, let alone legal fees, and nobody likes paying lawyers. So at the end of the day, I think that a lot of associates don't get their contracts reviewed. And I have a lot of associates that reach out to me and say, hey, I kind of got screwed on my last deal. I didn't have an attorney review it. I'm never doing that again. I'm embarking on another associateship. Can you please review that for me? And the issue is there are consequences to not having an attorney review an associate agreement because there are not, for instance, there's a non-compete most likely, depending on what state you're in. And that non-compete can restrict an associate from working elsewhere. And so it really limits the scope or the geography of where that associate can work. And the last thing an associate wants to do is be in a city they want to be in, have a failed associateship, and then now have their options limited as to where else they can work. So I think that's just one example of why it's really important to get that reviewed. We do review associate agreements all the time. And going on to the next topic, which is what you mentioned with respect to sort of an associate buy-in, a lot of associate agreements are now starting to add language that surrounds what happens in the future with respect to a buy-in. And you'll see everything from really bland language that frankly probably doesn't even need to be in the agreement. It's really more of a feel-good provision that says, hey, if the parties want to later on and it works for everybody, then they will discuss a partnership. And that's really sort of like fluffy and vague and doesn't really get either party any further than they were if they didn't have it in the agreement, but really it just sort of makes everybody feel good. So I've seen everything from that extreme to guaranteed buy-in language that says on X date, the associate will purchase blank amount of interest for blank price or at blank valuation. And this is how the partnership will be structured. And it kind of goes through all the decision making and et cetera. It just kind of like goes all the way down the road with what would be involved in that partnership, and very thorough. So I think that really what an associate puts in that agreement depends on the circumstances. I think if the parties are very committed to each other and they know 100% that ownership is what is going to happen, then I think it is important to get the terms stipulated in writing with respect to what will occur after the associateship. I think if the parties are still wanting to get comfortable with each other, then it's probably best to discuss the ownership aspect together in good faith, knowing that that's the intent, but you don't necessarily have to have language in the agreement to that effect. Now, there is a middle road that I've been seeing and doing quite often, which is the associate will put a certain portion of the money that they receive in their compensation on a monthly basis into escrow, sort of credited toward their purchase price down the road, which has two really good values. Number one, it gets the associate in the mode of making payments on a monthly basis, sort of getting in that mode of what they'll be doing when they get a loan to buy into the practice. But it also goes toward the purchase of interest in the partnership as a credit. So obviously they're paying it down already, and that's less for them to pay later on when they get their loan. It's also very beneficial for the employer to do that, because now they know that the associate has skin in the game and that they're committed, because there's a lot of employers out there that have been sort of screwed by associates where they had a retirement plan and a transition plan and they thought everything was going to go great, and the associate bails on them, and now they've got to go back to the drawing board. So it really helps both sides. And then obviously there could be provisions in there that say if the employer fires the associate gets their money back. And if the associate just says, hey, this isn't a good fit, then the employer gets released that money. And actually, I'm working on a deal right now that I wasn't involved with from inception, but the associate came to me asking me to look at the documents because they are actually going to be getting out of that associateship and forfeiting the money that they put forth toward the buy-in. And they're comfortable with that, but they want to be released from the non-compete. And, there's other things that we're negotiating in the deal. So to kind of summarize my answer, I think that, yes, I review associate agreements all the time. Yes, I think it's imperative that associates get those reviewed. There are many ways to structure the associateship, and it's everywhere from non-committal to committal to somewhere in between. And I think that's something to really explore with your team. And it's really key to have a dental specific team, lawyer, CPA, et cetera, so that you can have the most successful and optimal experience from an associate and transition standpoint.
And I love the examples that you included, because one of the things you said is the opposite of what we hear about a lot, which is the person who has someone lined up to buy their practice that bails on them and kind of screws them over. We tend to find the other way around, of like associates who are promised a hint of ownership, but nothing is ever put to paper, or it's kind of a not a very firm language in that contract. And so when it comes time to actually buy the practice or to make that decision, there hasn't been a strong enough trigger in the contract to like actually force anything to happen. And then they get strung along of like, well, not yet, or, maybe next year, or, I'm not sure about this, or, I don't know what the purchase price would be. I don't know how we're going to determine valuation, and dragging their feet on getting a valuation. So it's funny to realize that the opposite happens all the time as well, where the seller has someone that they're all excited to take over the practice for, and then they end up bailing and they leave them high and dry, and now they have to practice dentistry for longer than they were planning on.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, and I think that's so true that we often do. We hear tons of stories about the associate getting screwed and the employer warranting to the associate that they're going to sell to them, and the next thing you know, they pull the rug out, they go sell to a DSO instead, or they do something different. That does happen all the time, unfortunately. But of course, there is that flip side where you'd be shocked at how many doctors I get calls from that say, hey, I've gotten screwed 2-3 times already by associates leaving me. I can't have that happen to me again. I need to retire. I need to create a transition plan. Can you please help me? So it definitely happens on both sides. And actually, I just finished a deal in Washington where the employer actually put up money as well into escrow. So the buyer or the associate put up money that was going to be buying in, and also the employer did. So it was like whoever leaves or whoever decides not to do this loses their money. So like the employer actually said, hey, I'll put skin in the game too. And if I don't follow through, you get my money. Right. So I think that's another way that I didn't mention that can happen. And I should have mentioned that because I just was involved in a deal involving it.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that's part of it too, is like, what is the pre-agreed upon teeth in this agreement, and how hard is it to hold someone to that? And it seems like putting money in escrow is a very real consideration for fulfilling terms versus kind of like, this is what we think we're going to do. But then it's not laid out what happens if that doesn't occur.
Yeah. I think you've nailed it there. And then there's also the personality. There's another argument to it, which is, sure, we can hold each other accountable legally, but let's say an associate does get screwed, right? Or let's say an employer does get screwed. Do they really want to partner with the other side anyway, right? Like, do they really would they really have wanted to hold the other side to their obligation when they've already shown their true colors? Because a partnership is a marriage, and it's not something to be taken lightly. And I think it's really critical to make sure that the personalities fit, because the number one reason, at least from my personal perspective in doing hundreds of thousands of partnerships over the years, is that personality is the number one reason why partnerships don't work out. People sometimes think it's money and other factors, and those can be. But the number one reason I see is personality. And so if you're already seeing things from the beginning, it's almost like an interview process at the associate phase. Maybe the writing's on the wall. So maybe it doesn't become as important that there was escrow or wasn't escrow. And that's why I'm actually okay if the associate and the employer want to be very, very flexible from the beginning and not bind each other to things, or maybe not even have the buy-in language in the agreement, because ultimately it's got to be a good fit, or it's really a failed exercise anyway. So there's that way to look at it as well.
This episode is brought to you by Swell. So all of us who are already using Swell know that it crushes reputation management. It's like turning on a steady stream of reviews that requires no effort from your team and just works. It's amazing. Additionally, it makes it easy to stay in touch with all of your patients before and after their visits. And it even has a great way to set up a virtual waiting room. But there's more good news. Swell has a brand new version of their platform. And on top of being simpler than ever to use, you can now actually get patients to pay via mobile, which is incredible. The reason that Swell is so effective at getting reviews is they make it easy. They've now brought that same ease of use to paying for dental treatment even after patients have left the office. Mobile payments are a great way to text them a reminder so they can pay at their convenience right on their phone. You can pay via credit or debit card, ACH, or even Apple Pay or Google Pay with just a few taps. No more phone calls, no more chasing people down with emails and letters that always seem to get lost. And it gets better. This new release includes Swell Schedule, which is an easy way for patients to request an appointment time that works for them, so you can lock down those appointments quicker. Listen, Swell is one of those things that you just need to try it out, turn it on, see the results, and then you're converted and you're like, well, I'm never going to shut this off. Listeners of the Shared Practices podcast can try Swell for free for 30 days. No commitment. Just set it up, see the results for yourself before you pay anything. To take advantage of this offer, head to swellcx.com/sharedpractices. That's swellcx.com/sharedpractices. how common is it to do evaluation at the time that the associateship starts, and then do evaluation at the time of buy-in? Because this is something we've talked about on the show of like, it would be nice if you can pull this off. And I just want to see from your volume of deals if this actually occurs on any frequency. So you decide on evaluation up front, and then you see how much you end up growing the practice. And then when the person goes to buy into the partnership, that they have earned some of that equity, like 50% of that equity that they grew the practice, they bring that to the table as like earned equity, and then they're buying their 50% of the first portion of the practice that they didn't earn, that they didn't help the practice improve. I don't know if I'm explaining that correctly, but this idea of it feels kind of gross as an associate to grow a practice significantly. And I know someone who's done this, who they came in, the practice was like 700,000. They grow it to 1.7, and then the partner says, "Sure, you can buy in. You need to buy in at the 1.7," and the associate can turn around and say, "Well, I without me, you would have still been at 700 because there wasn't two doctors here, growing this practice." But also at the same time, the owner can turn around and say, "Well, I was the one who took on the risk and had the debt and had the opportunity, all of these things together." So there's two sides to that argument. So I just wanted to hear your perspective on A, what's actually done, and B, if you, I guess if you're representing the buyer, that's what the buyer would really like to do. Any thoughts on a structure like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really cool topic, and actually it's somewhat controversial, and I'm glad that you asked about it. And for the listeners out there, I would say I probably represent more buyers than I do sellers nowadays, but at least through my experience in working with a lot of sellers, I at least can provide the other perspective, right? And so, yes, absolutely, Richard, there are issues with an associate feeling as if they've really built the practice, and then feeling also that they're not being credited for that when the valuation is popped on them later on. And certainly there are circumstances where I think it's a no-brainer that would apply. Like, for instance, I recently helped an associate that was essentially going to run a brand new location, and they were going to be responsible for marketing and bringing in the patients. And the goal was for them to buy in and become really the leader of that location. And it was a no-brainer that they would certainly be credited for what they've done, because they basically built that other practice or are building that other practice. You get the other perspective where, some employers would argue the value that you're bringing to the practice is building the business. And performing dental work, anybody can perform dental work. Not anybody, but any qualified dentist can perform dental work, right? And so that's not where the value is. That is replaceable. Really, where you bring the value is by bringing in the business, by bringing in referral sources, or by bringing in patients to the practice. That adds to the value of the practice. If it's the good, but then of course there's still that argument that, well, you're bringing in patients as an associate by virtue of using my as an owner's goodwill in the community, and maybe they wouldn't have even come if they didn't know you were associated with my practice, right? And so there's all this like gray area of really what constitutes contribution to value and growing of the value of the practice. I'm not a CPA. I don't value practices, and I don't profess to give any financial advice, but I am at least saying that there are different perspectives on this of really what constitutes growing the practice. Is it just producing in there and the value grows? Or is that really not that key, because anybody can produce in there? That's what you're getting paid for as an associate. You're getting paid money in exchange for that work that you're doing. You're already compensated for that. And then the value really being more about bringing in the business and growing the business with growing more patients and all that. So it is controversial, and I think it's addressed really differently in almost every deal. But I think where it is seemingly a no-brainer is the example that I gave you of my client who really was building that other location. And of course, they should be credited for their value there.
Okay. And I love that you said that it's going to be different for every deal. And I think that's absolutely the case. But I think the emotion side of this, I think there's this strong sense of fairness that comes to play in these discussions and negotiations. And it's hard for two parties' sense of fairness to perfectly line up and to find that middle ground where everyone feels like it was completely fair. And sometimes that's just not going to happen. One party is or isn't going to feel like it's fair. And unfortunately, sometimes the associate coming in with less leverage feels like they're the ones who were not treated fairly. Is that fair to say that on average, if someone is going to feel that way, very often it's the associate or the buying in partner?
Yeah, I definitely think way more often than not, it's the buying in or the associate that feels it is unfair. Because I think they work hard. I mean, look, all these associates are working really hard. And so they feel like they've put their blood, sweat, and tears into something that they're going to be buying into. And then they almost feel like it's a slap in the face that the value, there's no value attributed to what they've done to help. And sometimes I think that what's interesting is a saying out there that says if both sides don't like the valuation, then it must be right. So I don't, so maybe it's a matter of, both appointing an independent third party appraiser that both parties feel confident in, that doesn't have ties to either side or that they're comfortable with, that can come up with a valuation. And that's really at the end of the day what it is based on, industry standard. I mean, there's different things that can be done, but I would agree that I think that the associate does feel slighted more than the other way around, for sure. And that's not a good way to go into a partnership. I mean, again, partnership is about being on the same page. It's about understanding the other side. I think it's funny to hear this from a lawyer, but the best partnerships are the ones where you sign it and you never pick up the document again. And of course, we draft the documents and they're critical because unfortunately, many do have to pick them up again. But the goal is to never have to pick it up because you're always on the same page. It's not about running to a legal document to see what it says. It's about understanding each other and just knowing that each side wants to do the right thing. And so if you go into a relationship where one party feels that something isn't fair, they weren't treated fairly, that's not a good tone or a good way to enter into a partnership. So the hope is that everyone kind of gets on the same page before the associateship even starts, at least about the methodology or about who is going to perform the valuation so that they're well prepared and that they don't waste a year or however long they're going to associate for and then come to find out that they're not on the same page.
Totally. No, and I think that's the biggest thing is at that moment of joining a practice as an associate, is this potential seller? Because I think more commonly, I don't know what's more common, but our listeners tend to be looking for like, I want to associate at this practice and then buy it rather than like buy into a partnership. And if someone is not willing to have that conversation and not willing to put anything to paper, that's a pretty good sign that you just need to expect that this is going to be an associateship and this person will probably never sell to you. Even if they're telling you, yeah, I want to in a year or two, but they're not willing to like commit in the paper, I would set your expectations lower and maybe they'll surprise you and actually still want to sell the practice. But I think it's a good litmus test of like how willing and how anxious are they to sell this if they're willing to get it on paper.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I also think that there's a dynamic where I think you have to look at the sincerity of the employer if you're the associate, and you have to look at the flexibility factor. Anytime I review any type of associate agreement, it's an interview process. Remember, as an associate, you're interviewing the employer too. And so you have to assess the process and the type of reception you get to the comments that you're making to the legal agreements, as long as you're being fair and reasonable with your proposed changes. And one of the things that I think is really important is to see the reaction. So if you're sitting there as an associate, you with sincerity go to the employer and say, look, I understand that you have to evaluate whether this is the best fit for you to sell to me. And I have to evaluate whether this is the best fit for me as well. So I don't expect you as an employer to 100% commit to me at this point in time, and vice versa. That said, it would really make me feel better about the investment of my time into this process if we could put something in the legal document that really at least outlines the fact that I will be buying this practice, or that I might have a right of first refusal, so you're not going to pull the rug out and sell to someone else. And, if the employer is open to that, that means they're flexible. It means, hey, not necessarily what I would do, but I want this associate to feel comfortable. And if this is what it takes, then I want to make them feel comfortable, because that's going to be best for the whole, for everybody. If they're happy, there's a better chance I'm going to be happy. That's what you're looking for. What you have to be aware of as an associate, really with any aspect of your agreement, not just the buy-in, is if you ask for something that is fair and market and reasonable, and the employer is not amenable to it, and the reaction is really closed down with no flexibility, that's most likely how the relationship is going to go and the whole transition experience. And granted, aside from the employer maybe working back for you as an associate, sort of like not a partnership, but in some respects it is, because they're still working with you at the practice and you still have to deal with them. Aside from that, it's really a walk-away sale in this instance. But how do you know, if you can't even get past the negotiations of the associate agreement, how do you know you're even going to be able to get through the associateship when issues arise, or more so the negotiation of purchase documents, which are far more expansive and thorough than an associate agreement? And so really what I try to do in my practice is I have really three goals. I want to help clients save time, save money, and save headaches. And so I'm always very upfront and transparent with associates or employers about what they might be getting into based on the flexibility in that interview process to negotiate the contract. And so that's really my goal. So hopefully that answers the question.
Absolutely. The other thing that I want to bring up, mostly because there's a post about this morning, I think it might have been in the shared practices group, about someone was looking for a transition attorney, and they were like, who do you know that has like a package deal? All of these attorneys seem to charge hourly. And my response was like, why would you want a package deal? If it takes less time, they charge you less. If it takes more time, they charge you more. And I think in dental, sometimes we're the other way around, where it's like, if a crown takes me 3 hours or a crown takes me an hour or 30 minutes, we're charging the same amount. And so talk to me about your decision to really kind of have not necessarily packages that people are buying, but bill by the hour like most attorneys do.
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that. I think it's important to discuss it. Traditionally, attorneys bill by the hour, as you mentioned, and it is the fairest way to do it from a standpoint of whatever the time is, that's what you get billed for, if you want to view it in that sense. I think traditionally attorneys get a bad name because, and I deal with it on those, I'd be lying if I said I haven't been on deals before where I'm wondering if what the attorney on the other side is doing is sadly, a product of wanting to bill more, because it's like, why would they even go to that length to do that? It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't seem within the spirit of what we're trying to do here. All the clients kind of agreed on this, but they're going that direction. It just doesn't seem, something smells fishy, right? So I think what attorneys have gotten a bad name for is maybe billing for things that maybe don't need to be billed for. And I don't mean that the attorneys are acting necessarily in bad faith. Like, I think that just sometimes they maybe want to be as thorough as possible, but they're not really seeing the big picture. And they need to be more efficient. It's about being efficient with your time. And so I think efficiency is what has sort of given attorneys a bad name. And sometimes a client just wants to get a deal done and they don't want to think about the 300th potential road that something could go down, because it unrealistically would probably never happen. So yeah, I think that's what kind of gives that a bad name. But also, I think the client has to keep in mind that it is, it is a fair way to do things as far as by the hour is concerned. Now, that said, if a client comes to me and says, I want to discuss a different method of billing or whatever it is, I'm always happy to discuss it. I'm very flexible in my personal practice. I want everybody to be happy. I want everyone to be on the same page. It's critical for me that everyone is on the same page from the beginning and that everybody's valuing everybody else's time. But I'm always open to that. Of course, I'm a lawyer, but I've been on the other side of it. I've been a client. I've sold businesses before that are not in the dental industry, and I've had attorneys, and I've been billed massively before. And, again, I've kind of wondered, what went into some of this time. So I've been on that side, and I think it's the sticker shock thing. And so really what you can do as a client, if you are being billed by the hour, and of course, again, always talk to your attorney about being billed as a flat rate. If that's important to you, then your attorney should at least have a discussion with you about it. But one thing that you can do is just really ask the attorney to keep you informed, or you can always reach out to them and just kind of see where you're at hour-wise. I think the sticker shock thing of going through your deal and you're just not sure where you are, but maybe you could have asked, hey, where are we at right now, right? And then at least you'd kind of know. Because also, too, from an attorney standpoint, sometimes you're just grinding and you're spending nights and mornings and all day, and you're really busting it for the client. And then you send the bill, and sometimes the client will just be like, whoa, well, what is this? This doesn't make sense. This isn't fair. And you're thinking about, what are you talking about? Like, I've been putting my life into this deal, and this is pretty much all I've done. I'm backed up on other deals because I've been, catering to your deal to get you closed and all that kind of stuff. And so sometimes I think there's just like a lack of understanding of what's happening. And the best way to get an understanding is to communicate. And so I think, that's probably the best that I can answer that. But to summarize it, because I kind of, went on there, I would say, if you're getting billed by the hour and you have a concern, always communicate and ask for updates and see where you're at as a client. Or number two, if you want to go the flat rate, talk to your attorney about it and see if they'd be amenable to that and come up with something fair and reasonable for everybody.
Nice. Well, and I will say here, I have been very happy with all of the money that I've paid to you for your time and your services, and we'd be remiss if we didn't shout out Wayne Opplinger for referring me to you in the first place. And Wayne's a good friend and a really good guy. I will have to say, we're going to have to put a pause here in this episode. I feel like there's so much more to get to in terms of transaction or the transition process as a buyer, also partnerships, also DSOs, and some of these different structures. So are you open to coming back for another episode?
Yeah, I'd be thrilled and honored to come back. And I promise that when I come back, I will have a microphone, a high-tech microphone that I can plug in, and so that we'll be ready to roll.
Cool. No, this has been fantastic, and really appreciate you coming on the show and being patient with me, because I told you after my first deal that I'd have you on the show, and here we are like a year and a half, almost 2 years later, we're finally making it happen. So if someone is interested in reaching out to you, what is the best way for them to get a hold of you?
The best way to get a hold of me would be they can call me on my cell. I have a concierge style business, and that is I really want to be there for my clients, texting, calling, etc. So I always give my cell phone out to clients. I know this might be a dangerous thing to do on a podcast with as many awesome followers as you have, but I'm happy to give it out. My cell phone number is 206-919-9060, and also email. I'm really good with email. It's David at Cohen Law Firm, CohenLawFirm PLLC.com. So David at Cohen Law Firm PLLC.com. And I'm really good at getting back to people and just love being a resource. I mean, even if a client's like not hiring me and they have a question, I'm happy to always chat about it.
Thanks for coming on the show.
It's exciting, and I just feel honored to be a part of it. Love to do it again.
Cool. Well, we will talk with you all next time on the Shared Practices Podcast.